For most of us, the recent GOP primary provided a great deal of entertainment. But for the men and women of conservative media, it hasn't been so fun. They found themselves in a challenging situation. The early frontrunner, the man with all of the money and all of the momentum, was one of the least conservative candidates in the field. He was also the one they believed had the best chance to beat Barack Obama. So they faced a choice: back the more electable candidate or back the more ideologically pure ones. And a lot rode on this decision: their conservative credentials, their leadership role in the movement, perhaps even the outcome of the primaries and the general election itself. Well, what happened next was some pretty riveting internecine warfare. It pitted the reluctant Romneyites against an anybody but Romney crowd that was anything but united. Before the first caucus hand was raised or the first primary ballot cast, the journal National Review came out in support of Romney. The backlash was instantaneous. Talk show host Rush Limbaugh used the moment to declare himself the last vestige of true conservative media. Others lamented the nation's oldest conservative publication had, as one writer put it, lived long enough for us to see them become the villain. The divisions that fractured conservative media this year shows how fraught tangling in elections can be for conservative media. They force the question of how much conservative media should allow core ideology to give way to more practical considerations. Do you tie your reputation to someone who may not be the most conservative, but is instead conservative enough? When compromise is anathema to one's worldview, how much can you negotiate before you've lost your credibility? These questions are crucial for those in conservative media, who provide not just ideas, but leadership for the movement. If they're found being true to a faith other than conservatism, carrying water for a candidate or an administration or for a party, their authenticity, and thus their authority, is thrown into question. Of course, Mitt Romney wasn't the first candidate to raise these questions for conservative media. That was Richard Nixon. And that takes us to the 1960s. So as we dive in, let me lay out a few basic ideas. First, when I talk about conservative media, I'm talking about the print and broadcast sources that are national in scope, explicitly conservative in ideology, and mostly secular in nature. And the ones that I look at in my book are the oldest ones. They're all formed in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. There's the magazine National Review, the radio and then later television show, the Mannion Forum, Human Events, which is a news weekly, and the publishing company, Regnery Publishing. Collectively, they make up the first wave of conservative media, and the people who founded them make up what I call the messengers of the right. The second thing that I want to outline before we go into things is that I think it's important to think of media not just as conduits for ideas or platforms for spin and messaging. Instead, let's think of media as institutions, as businesses, as interlocking relationships, as sources of authority, continuity, and identity formation. As institutions, these medias do more than just spread conservative ideas. By the mid-1960s, they had played a pivotal role in founding key right-wing organizations and in launching Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign. And it's that campaign that kicks us off. So Barry Goldwater was conservatism personified. He was the face of the movement, thanks to the efforts of the messengers. In the 1964 election, conservative media spoke with one voice in their support of Goldwater, both in the GOP primaries and in the general election. And then this happened. One of the greatest shellackings in modern presidential history. So it's no wonder that by the time they turned their attention to the 1968 race, the messengers were already starting to reconsider the balance between ideology and electability. There was just one problem. Mr. Electable in 1968 was Richard Nixon. The messengers and Nixon had a long history. As a congressman in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Nixon won over conservatives as an ardent communist hunter. But this rising star of the right soon lost his gleam when he teamed up with Dwight Eisenhower. Ike was a modern Republican, or to hear the conservatives talk about it, a Democrat light. And as his vice president, Nixon was tarred with the same moderate brush. By 1960, Nixon was the heir apparent to the Republican nomination, and the messengers strongly opposed his candidacy. They believed he was both too moderate in his politics and too untrustworthy in his promises. As the election loomed, they found themselves fantasizing about last-minute, long-shot candidates and third-party alternatives. And even here, Nixon spoiled the fun. Clarence Mannion of the radio program The Mannion Forum spent much of 1959 and 1960 organizing for Goldwater. But Goldwater had close ties with Nixon. For someone like National Review founder Bill Buckley, this scotched Goldwater's candidacy. Buckley explained to Mannion, "To the extent we build up Goldwater, and Goldwater ends up building up Nixon, we have contributed to the ascendancy of Nixon, and this I am not in the mood temperamentally to do." While Buckley and Mannion may have disagreed on Goldwater, they definitely saw eye to eye on Nixon. As Mannion said in response to Buckley, "Like you, my first 1960 objective is to beat Nixon. He is an unpredictable, supremely self-interested trimmer and has never been anything else."
What year was that, sir?
That's in 1959 and 60.
Wow.
And theirs was a widely shared opinion. After a correspondent asked National Review to support Nixon in 1960, its publisher, Bill Rusher, asked incredulously, "Where and when did Nixon earn the right to be trusted by conservatives?" Rusher listed a bevy of Nixon apostasies, supporting Nikita Khrushchev's visit to the United States, backing Earl Warren's Supreme Court nomination, defending the World Court. Rusher continued, "To say that a man with that record should be allowed a little indulgence is to win the Understatement Award of 1960. He needs massive unilateral forgiveness." It was forgiveness that Rusher was unwilling to grant. In a race between Nixon and John Kennedy, he preferred to, as he put it, do the open, simple, and honest thing. Namely, refuse to vote for either man. And there was that crippling loss in 1964. That taught the messengers it wasn't enough for a candidate to be conservative, he also had to be electable. 1964 taught Nixon something too. He learned a candidate couldn't win the presidency with just conservatives, but he also couldn't win without them. Based on this, Nixon began openly courting the messengers. He made it clear that he believed right-wing media were key to winning conservative support. This attention was heady stuff for a group of political activists accustomed to being on the outside looking in. Nixon's courtship of the messengers began in August 1966. He invited members of conservative media and organizations to the Shoreham Hotel in D.C. Ostensibly, the hotel rendezvous was just a chat. Nixon talked about Vietnam, about inflation, about the midterm elections. But the subject of the conversation hardly mattered. The fact of the conversation, the display he made of reaching out, that was key. Having made his intentions known, Nixon dialed up the charm. In January 1967, he invited Buckley, Rusher, and other members of the conservative media to his swank Fifth Avenue townhouse. There he plunged into a discussion of foreign and domestic policy, displaying his encyclopedic command of the political world. Rusher remained unmoved. Rusher would always remain unmoved when it came to Nixon. But Buckley? There was no more direct route to Buckley's heart than a vigorous exhibition of intellect and insight. As one attendee recalled, "I knew when we were going down the elevator early in the evening that Bill Buckley was going to find some reason to support Richard Nixon." True, Nixon was no movement conservative, but the heart wants what it wants. And a smart, experienced, electable Republican was just what Bill Buckley wanted in 1968. Now, not everyone was so moved. Nixon may have seen the print periodicals like National Review and Human Events as key to conservative support. But the world of conservative media was much bigger than that. And unlike 1964, there were other candidates to consider. Ronald Reagan, though not fully committed to running, stalked the nomination process from the sidelines. He found support from people like Devin Garrity of the conservative publishing company, Devin Adair. Garrity poured his efforts into Reagan's 1968 book, The Creative Society, hoping it would do for Reagan what the conscience of a conservative did for Goldwater. And then there was George Wallace, the segregationist Southern Democrat running as a third-party candidate. Mannion supported Nixon, but he believed that Wallace would help pull Nixon to the right, so he promoted the governor on his program. And Wallace was happy to appear, eager to make his case to a broad conservative audience. Wallace, Nixon, Reagan, support for all three of these candidates flowed through conservative media, and the debates about candidates mattered. Listeners and readers turned to the messengers as their guides, as resources for determining who the real conservatives in the race were. And just a few examples, a Texas listener asked Mannion whether Nixon, who had been the star of the House Un-American Activities Committee, was, in the letter writer's words, genuinely anti-communist. In Idaho, a listener wanted Mannion to rank Nixon, Reagan, and Wallace, particularly after reading articles that questioned Reagan's conservatism. As in 1960 and 64, the messengers were acting as guides for electoral politics. And yet, despite personal preferences for Reagan and Wallace, the messengers soon coalesced behind Nixon. Reagan may have seen Nixon, as he put it, as the fellow who doesn't get the girl. But Reagan underestimated how much his own inexperience diminished his appeal as a would-be suitor. Perhaps someone from a different background could have won over the messengers after just 2 years as governor. But Reagan had been an actor. When Barry Goldwater was mounting his presidential bid, Reagan was starring as a mob boss in a remake of Ernest Hemingway's The Killers. He may have been a handsome, well-seasoned 57-year-old, but it just wasn't his time. And choosing not to run in the primaries did little to make the case that he was electable. And so it was that while someone like Garrity believed, in his words, Reagan's philosophy is basically my own, as with the rest of the messengers, he couldn't resist backing a likely winner. He wrote a friend, "As far as I'm concerned, Nixon would make a very good president, and I'm entirely for him." He loved Reagan, but he voted Nixon. Well, Nixon will easily win the nomination, and once he did, conservative media brimmed with endorsements. Yes, the editors of National Review admitted Nixon was far from an inspiring candidate, but they urged readers to keep the faith, in their words, that when he gets the votes he needs, Nixon will speak with a clearer, firmer, less neutrally balanced voice. The messengers listened to the movement. When negotiating politics, candidates would have to move to the center. Conservatives would have to trust that candidates would govern further to the right than they campaigned. And they would have to trust conservative media to divine the true intentions of the candidate in question, to suss out their core beliefs. Well, Nixon goes on to win the 1968 election by razor-thin margins. For the former vice president, it was vindication. For conservative media, it was unprecedented opportunity. Since the emergence of the modern conservative movement after World War II, no candidate backed by conservatives had won the presidency. Nixon's election opened a new world for the movement and its messengers, one ripe with opportunity and one rife with obstacles. No sooner had Nixon won the White House than the messengers began to worry. They knew Nixon wasn't likely to govern as a conservative unless he was pressured to do so. But how best to apply that pressure? Should they behave as they had during the campaign, rallying conservatives behind Nixon to demonstrate their loyalty? Or should they attack early and often to make it clear Nixon wouldn't get a pass simply because he wasn't Lyndon Johnson? Well, let's look at one of the earliest issues facing the administration, appointments. Here, Mannion called for the messengers to get in a few kicks to ensure the administration knew they were paying attention. He was supported by conservatives in the administration, most notably speechwriter Pat Buchanan and White House aide Tom Houston. These insiders turned to conservative media to pressure their boss on what Houston called the disastrous series of liberal appointments following the inauguration. At National Review, Rusher fielded this call, and he was all for a full-boil attack. But the magazine's editorial on appointments barely reached a simmer. The editors counseled patience, arguing foreign affairs, not appointments, would be the real test of Nixon's conservative bona fides. So temperate, so patient, and so out of line with the bold bluster that had made the magazine the vigorous and incorruptible journal of conservative opinion it claimed to be in its first issue. This even-handedness drew a scathing response from Human Events publisher Bob Kephart. Human Events had adopted what Kephart called a rake-em-over-the-coals approach to the administration, and he burned at the thought that National Review was positioning itself and its platform of responsible conservatism to the left of Human Events. On one occasion in 1969, Kephart mocked Bill Rusher for seeking the secret conservatism of Richard Nixon. He wrote, "I'm afraid if all you formerly solid types hop on the administration bandwagon this way, it will make it difficult for legitimate conservatism to flourish." Rejecting the label responsible conservative, Kephart continued, "Henceforth, I shall answer to legitimate conservative, leaving, I suppose, an unfortunate but appropriate antonym for those on my left." Rusher being Rusher, he couldn't let this attack go unanswered. Call him illegitimate, sure, but don't ever call him a Nixon supporter. He had never backed Nixon, and even now awaited the president's disappointments with what he called a gloomy sort of relish. He was even cynically confident Nixon would soon prove unworthy of Buckley's lingering affection, and that the magazine could then return to its oppositional labors. But a return to the politics of opposition, the lingua franca of conservatism, wasn't an easy call to make. Conservative media couldn't dismiss Nixon out of hand because whatever doubts he raised, having him in power had its benefits. Let's look again at those appointments. The right may have carped about them, but Nixon didn't ignore conservatives when it came to staffing the government. When a spot opened on the Federal Communications Commission, Nixon appointed Dean Birch as the new chairman. Birch was an inspired choice. He had played a central role in the Goldwater campaign, then served as the chair of the Republican National Convention, or the Republican National Committee, before being forced out by the party's more liberal wing. As FCC chair, he could set the tone for how the agency's policies would be carried out, particularly the Fairness Doctrine, which was the bête noire of conservative media. This doctrine, which called for balance on controversial topics, had long been used to deny right-wing broadcasters airtime. Broadcasters like Mannion felt confident Birch could change that. And he did. Over the course of the Nixon administration, the Fairness Doctrine still existed, but conservatives didn't have to worry about the administration using the FCC against them, something that they had to worry about under Kennedy and Johnson. Friends in high places were even more valuable on a fundamental level. Nixon may not have been conservative, but he understood that the mood of the country was shifting in ways that aligned with fundamental conservative ideas. Under Nixon, concepts central to the messenger's worldview, most notably liberal media bias, became subjects of national debate. Liberal bias was an article of faith for the messengers, something upon which they staked their legitimacy. The argument went like this. Established media reflected the liberal biases of their creators, and thus needed to be balanced by media that reflected conservative ideas. While the movement embraced this argument, at the time, most Americans still believed in journalistic objectivity. They viewed Walter Cronkite as most trusted man in America, not a mouthpiece of liberal propaganda. Then came Nixon. Now, Nixon's evaluation of established media wasn't quite the same as the right's. His antipathy toward the press wasn't abstract theory or conservative cosmology. It was personal. From the moment he growled at reporters in 1962, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," the lines were drawn. Of course, Nixon wasn't the first president to complain about attacks from the media. Thomas Jefferson grumbled about anti-administration press coverage for much of his second inaugural address. And many a president and other leaders reportedly complained, "If I walked on top of the Potomac River in the morning, the headline that afternoon would read, 'President can't swim.'" But it took the Nixon administration to turn this complaint about anti-administration slant into one about systemic liberal bias. And the person who's going to lead that charge for the administration is Spiro Agnew. Greeted at the convention with a collective, "Spiro who?" Agnew's nomination raised no hopes for the right, nor for himself. He quipped about his ascension to the vice presidency, "I moved from a potential unknown to an actual unknown." But within a year of taking office, Agnew had become the saving grace for conservatives. Agnew's breakthrough came in Iowa in November 1969. In a speech assailing liberal bias, Agnew questioned the wisdom of handing the influence of the press to a close fraternity of privileged men, elected by no one. Surely, he argued, Americans deserve better than a steady diet of liberal bias disguised as neutrality. After all, he said, a democratic society couldn't function without an informed populace. A well-informed populace, that is, not one misled by half-truths, obfuscation, and spin. Agnew's speech grabbed headlines, putting questions of media objectivity and liberal bias front and center in the national conversation. And of course, the messengers seized upon this development. They turned Agnew into a touchstone, into proof that theirs was a legitimate grievance. Agnew was suddenly all over conservative media. He was in man-informed fundraising and human events columns and right-wing audio forums. By the early 1970s, conservatives could place on their bookshelves Agnew, Profile and Conflict, next to The Enemies He Has Made, The Media versus Spiro Agnew. So Agnew became popular, and he popularized the charge, but it was the messengers who provided the support for it. The heavy lifting fell to Edith Ephron, a writer for TV Guide. Ephron began documenting liberal bias for a book called The News Twisters, which appeared in 1971. With research funds made available by Buckley, Ephron compiled what purported to be a scientific study of liberal bias. Her method involved watching news coverage of the 1968 election. She then tallied up favorable and unfavorable comments about Nixon and about his challenger, Hubert Humphrey. Crunching the numbers, she found about 50% of all words spoken about Humphrey were positive. For Nixon, a paltry 8.7%. No wonder she concluded network news followed what she called the elitist liberal left line in all controversies. Now, her methodology was clearly subject to confirmation bias. It laid the veneer of science over a largely unscientific method. But despite its weaknesses, the News Twisters won accolades across conservative media. In the lead-up to the book's publication, National Review promised to make a special splash. But, Buckley added, this is too good to preempt just for ourselves. So Ephron appeared in the Mannion Forum, in Human Events, on Firing Line, on The Advocates, all across conservative media. And it wasn't just conservative media who were interested in making sure Ephron's book made a splash. Nixon, of course, saw the value in a work that showed that the press was biased against him. He ordered special counsel Chuck Colson to get the book on the New York Times bestsellers list. And Colson managed to do it. He figured out which stores were used to calculate book sales, and he went to all of them, bought up all the copies of News Twisters. For years, Nixon staffers stumbled across big boxes stuffed full of the News Twisters. But the trick worked. Ephron's book became an official New York Times bestseller, and the issue of media bias remained part of the national conversation. So there were benefits to being close to power, and they extended beyond book buying. In the wake of Agnew's speech, the messenger sensed a climate change in American media. Mannion pointed to the 1971 launch of Spectrum, a sort of op-ed page for the CBS Morning News, which included a number of right-wing commentators. Elsewhere on CBS, 60 Minutes pitted conservative James J. Kilpatrick against liberal Nicholas von Hoffman in a segment called Point Counterpoint. Kilpatrick traced this development back to Agnew, saying that after the vice president's speech, a sea change came over my friends in New York. All of a sudden they began to think, my gracious, there is another point of view in this country after all. Even the publisher of Human Events, who made a living selling an alternative to the liberal dominance of the media, had to admit conservatives were popping up all over established media outlets. They were even turning up in the editorial pages of what he called that holy house organ of liberalism, the New York Times. Though it would take a few decades to fully flower, by the early 1970s, conservatives were taking the first steps towards what would become one of their greatest victories, substituting balance for objectivity as journalism's governing value. And the charge likely wouldn't have gained the traction it did without the support of the Nixon administration. So being close to power had its benefits, but remember, Nixon wasn't a conservative. The administration may have helped on FCC appointments and media bias, issues that helped the Nixon administration as much as conservative media. But when it came to the right's core battle cry, rollback, Nixon was nowhere to be found. Roll back the federal state, roll back the communist threat, not on Nixon's watch. What bomb was there for conservatives in policies like the Family Assistance Plan, which would establish a guaranteed annual income, or the Philadelphia Plan, which instituted affirmative action guidelines for federal contracts? Yet it was foreign policy, not domestic, that turned the messengers solidly against Nixon. Mannion privately worried the president would try to mellow communists rather than defeat them. But publicly, he called for patience. Sure, the president straddled the fence, but all that meant was that Nixon, in Mannion's words, has one leg on the right side of the fence. That's one more leg than we had under Johnson and Kennedy. Then came China. The decision to open relations with the communist country signaled to conservatives Nixon wasn't straddling the fence anymore. He jumped right over onto the wrong side. No rollback, not even containment. Now it was all handshakes and agreements and thaw. Call it détente, call it normalizing relations, but the right saw it as the gravest of capitulations, the worst of treasons. When Nixon announced his trip to China, even his most enthusiastic supporters in conservative media recoiled. Buckley immediately gathered a dozen conservative leaders to his Upper East Side home. They called themselves the Manhattan 12, and the majority of them came from conservative media. And that day at Buckley's home, they set about writing an anti-Nixon statement. And the way the statement got put together and the final product reveal how much the messengers had lost their bite in the Nixon era, how willing they were to pull their punches. Buckley, a friend of the president and the least prepared to break with him, repeatedly tempered the language and softened the blows. By the end of the day, the Manhattan 12 had produced not a repudiation of Nixon, but a rebuke, a suspension of support. They would complain about the president, but they wouldn't formally oppose him. The statement even ended with a reaffirmation of our personal admiration for Nixon and a declaration that our defection is an act of loyalty to the Nixon we supported in 1968. Still, it was a break and a public one. The Nixon administration rushed to bring the messengers back into the fold in the wake of this defection. The president sent Pat Buchanan to take care of the human events crowd and brought Buckley to Washington to meet with Henry Kissinger. Kissinger got Buckley on board, but there was little Buckley could do to counteract the administration's actions in the fall of 1971. After the China trip announcement came wage and price controls, the arms control treaties, the UN vote to admit China. Nixon even sent the popular Agnew to make peace with the messengers, but to no avail. The truth was, in 1971, Nixon simply wasn't conservative enough anymore. So the messengers opposed him in the 1972 primaries. They instead backed conservative Ohio Congressman John Ashbrook and his No Left Turn campaign. And this campaign comes about thanks to the messengers, two in particular, Bill Rusher at National Review and Tom Winter of Human Events. They're the ones who approached Ashbrook and asked him to challenge Nixon. When Ashbrook announced his candidacy, National Review immediately endorsed him. It was something that Rusher had worked out well in advance, despite some hesitations from the most ardent Nixon supporters on staff. Human Events offered a front-page endorsement and a glowing 4-page review of Ashbrook's career and philosophy. Praise rolled in from the Indianapolis News and Manchester Union Leader. Mannion, too, lobbied hard to gin up conservative support for Ashbrook, standing behind the congressman despite the long odds. Showing little evidence of having lived through 1964, he argued that as long as a candidate had good conservative credentials, the rest would fall into place. Rusher echoed these sentiments. Regardless of how Ashbrook might actually perform, he said, I am profoundly glad that Ashbrook is in these primaries. By his actions, he has preserved the conservative position. Not in good health, to be sure, but at least alive and capable of being fought for. Now, the messengers met resistance in their attempt to overthrow Nixon from some of their favorite politicians. Reagan batted away claims that Nixon had sold out conservative principles. Barry Goldwater opted, as usual, for a more apocalyptic tone. He warned that the anti-Nixon insurgency endangered, in his words, the entire party, the entire country, the entire free world, and freedom itself. Which is pretty good for Ashbrook's campaign. The politician's message, in other words, ideological purity was fine for intellectuals, but in the world of practical politics, it has no place. The resistance was a moot point anyway. Ashbrook garnered around 10% of the vote in a few states, then quietly folded his campaign. In the wake of his withdrawal, National Review endorsed Nixon, chiding readers, this is not the season to be churlish. This simply wouldn't do. The messengers couldn't in one breath dismiss Nixon as an apostate and in the next restore him with no discernible shift in Nixon's policies. If visiting China, implementing wage and price controls, backing environmental regulations, and all the rest could win a candidate conservative media support, then what did their support really mean? What was, in Rusher's question, the point at which the difference between two evils, a meaningless question? As it turned out, this foray into practical politics came at a price. Conservative media institutions foundered in the Nixon era. Readership and audiences declined, along with the messenger's influence. And just a few numbers make the point. At the Mannion Forum, revenues declined 28% between 1968 and 69, and another 45% by the time Nixon ran for re-election. By 1973, National Review's circulation lagged 20% behind its pre-Nixon heights. Human Events had to launch a reorganization after considerable losses in 73 and 74, by which point it had shed well over 40% of its pre-Nixon subscription totals. And at Regnery Publishing, things were even worse. By 1971, Regnery had no capital and no credit left. He turned his company over to his son-in-law, who promptly dumped the unprofitable conservative backlist. There's a lot of things that come into play with this. There are economic factors like inflation, but there was something bigger at play, something that the messengers figured out themselves. The main problem, they determined, was the Nixon Compromise, all of the Nixon compromises. The messengers had given up their oppositional voice, their ideological identity, for a seat at the table, and it showed. At the Forum, at Human Events, at National Review, the messengers all came to the same conclusion. The one-time leaders of the movement had lost their edge. At the Mannion Forum, the problem was a dearth of new ideas and fresh faces. The program that had elevated Barry Goldwater to national prominence no longer helped develop new leadership, new personalities for the conservative cause. At National Review, ennui settled in. This led Rusher to ask in 1973, on what subject in the last 4 years has National Review clearly been the bellwether of the American conservative community? Having failed to provide leadership meant, as he put it, the conservative troops increasingly march off to tunes drummed out by latecomers. The messengers also noted that the movement itself had been badly damaged by the Nixon era. Primary tussles over Nixon, Wallace, Reagan, and Ashbrook, battles over whether or not to support the administration, the China trip, the Watergate scandal, the Agnew resignation, whatever energies united conservatives in the mid-60s wilted during the Nixon presidency. In light of all this, Rusher put forth the elegant argument that the decline of conservative media was, in his words, simply a synecdoche of the present condition of American conservatism as a whole. The rudderless movement, he declared, can scarcely define, let alone organize itself. So the 70s saw the first wave of conservative media ebb and eventually come to an end. Many of the institutions would remain, but it would be quite some time before they would have anything like the influence they had in their first 25 years. But with a genuine conservative winning office in 1980, the stage was set for a new set of messengers to emerge. Rush Limbaugh went national in 1988, Fox News launched in 1996. Less intellectual and more entertaining than their predecessors, this second wave of conservative media proved far more profitable and far more powerful. 40 years ago, Nixon could woo the messengers without wedding them. Today's Republican candidates can't do the same. That's an important difference, one that's easy to forget given striking similarities between the Nixon era and the 2012 race. Just yesterday, Mitt Romney took a page from the Nixon playbook. He held an off-the-record conversation with several dozen conservative bloggers, reporters, and columnists. One of the attendees described it as sort of an olive branch to conservative media. And borrowing from Bill Buckley, the current editor of National Review has said about Romney's nomination and candidacy, "If I have to manufacture enthusiasm, I'll happily do so." Given these similarities to the Nixon era, it's tempting to think that the danger to conservative media in 2012 is losing their identity as they compromise in favor of Romney. These are the lessons, right, from the 1960s. Goldwater showed what happened when ideology is allowed to run roughshod over electability, and Nixon showed what happened when the messengers dallied too far down the primrose path of pragmatism. And it is worth keeping those lessons in mind. Certainly National Review's reputation among movement conservatives has suffered from coming out a little too early for Romney. That said, my view is that even though 2012 looks a lot like 1968, the dynamics are actually quite different. Indeed, what we're witnessing is not the limits of pragmatism, but the cost of insisting on ideological purity. Today, Republican politicians don't just reach out to the messengers, but they live in fear of them. We see elected officials and party chairs apologize for crossing Rush Limbaugh, and presidential candidates refuse to distance themselves from his incendiary comments. We see candidates assiduously protecting their right flank from conservative media attacks, to the point that they find themselves denouncing things like contraception and college education. This makes it difficult for a nominee like Mitt Romney, who raced so far to the right during the primary that pivoting to the center is going to create some issues. He'll have a lot of cover from conservative media, but he'll also be beholden to them in return. I think this is a real problem in today's current political scene, and I don't have any easy answers for it. But let me end with Bill Rusher's reflection on the distinct roles of the messengers and the politicians they support. There is surely no harm, he said, in recognizing that there is a real and necessary difference between the role of tablet keepers like ourselves and that of a political leader who must persuade substantial majorities to go along with him. That distinction sounds right to me, and when the messengers in the party rediscover those roles, they'll likely be in much better shape.
Questions?
We've talked a lot about this, as you know, Nikki, but could you help explain the historiography of the conservative media backlash against Nixon during this period? How developed is the historiography?
Well, right, it depends on what historiography you're looking at. When historians are looking specifically at conservative media figures, they tend to get this more. So when Judas is looking at Bill Buckley, when E.J. Dionne is looking at this moment, they don't see the full spectrum. They only see National Review, right? So they see Nixon courting National Review, but they don't see all this conflict that's happening among all these other media institutions. So it's a little short-sighted, but the story of National Review and Nixon is one that's covered to a certain extent. As you know, in more popular books like Nixonland, it's paid no attention to.
So this is new terrain then you're covering?
Yeah, I mean the things that, the conflict within conservative media, which I think is pretty critical to understanding these ideas, is something that hasn't been covered.
Thanks very much, Nikki. That was really interesting. Going back to 1959-60, there was a conservative media there who thought Nixon was too much of a moderate. And you said, I forget the actual words here, but basically, I take it they were already in favour of rolling back the welfare state then and other programs then. How much was foreign policy, how much was domestic policy? And given how primitive the welfare state was then, did they basically want to roll it back to nothing?
That's a fair question. I would say that at this point in time, anti-communism is such a strong strain in conservatism that if you had to pick one over the other, foreign policy is going to be the more pressing issue. But domestic policy matters quite a bit as well. I mean, conservatives saw a sort of bipartisan consensus on the New Deal. They wouldn't have said that the welfare state was in a nascent stage. They would have seen it as creeping socialism and America already going far too much down the path of Europe and towards socialism. And they believed that neither party was defending that. And when Eisenhower calls himself a modern Republican, he's talking about, not necessarily extending the welfare state, but certainly preserving the gains of the New Deal. And conservatives were really frustrated with that because, again, this idea of rollback, which is one of the most central ones, nobody is out there advocating that in the leadership of the Republican Party and the leadership of the Democratic Party. So they feel shut out, that nobody is advocating for the things that they think are central to saving America in the wake of World War II.
On that question, I'm sorry for hogging. I'm curious about this foreign policy record of Nixon in the late 50s is very hawkish and stridently anti-communist. What more could the Republican conservative media wanted from Richard Nixon on the foreign policy front? I mean, it doesn't really change, as you know, until the late 60s when he becomes president or on the eve of becoming president. How is he seen as being soft on communism or not as hardline as they were?
Well, both Eisenhower and Nixon, so they're sort of paired up together, really crossed conservatives in 1959 when they agreed to Khrushchev's visit to the United States. I mean, this was one of the first organizational activities that conservative media helped lead, and that is this mass movement, or what they were hoping would be a mass movement, to protest Khrushchev's visit. It's conservative media who are out front organizing the opposition to it, organizing protests, organizing rallies, and they see it as a gross betrayal of both American ideals and of all of the countries that are locked in communism. So they...
Even though there's those famous kitchen debates where Nixon really gives it to Khrushchev.
Yeah, he does, but the fact that he's talking to Khrushchev is actually a problem. And then the visit, of course, follows that. And they're incredibly unhappy with that. And he's okay with the World Court. So all of those things turn them against him.
I was interested in another little piece of this as well, which is that you talk about under the Nixon administration, the fairness policy, or the
Fairness doctrine.
The fairness doctrine begins to shift, and I think you used term substituting balance for objectivity, which I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But maybe you could trace for me a little bit about how this, because what's happened is it's really opened up the conservative media in a whole different way than the original messengers.
Right. Right. So the fairness doctrine was put in place back in the 1940s.
Right.
And it was used by both the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration to go after their critics. Nixon is going to use it as well to go after his critics. It's just that conservative media aren't those. He's not going to use the FCC against them. So they're looking for a space where they're not going to face any sort of pressures from this governmental agency. What they want is the fairness doctrine to be repealed. That's going to happen in 1987.
And the requirements of the fairness doctrine specifically are?
Right, so this is where things get really confusing because nobody actually knows what the requirements of the fairness doctrine are. In 1968, Congress holds a hearing to try to figure out what exactly is required. The actual statute itself, or the regulation itself, says that we give you the airwaves, the government gives you a license to use them, and so you have an obligation to cover controversial issues and to cover them fairly. So you have to give balance. It doesn't mean that you have to give equal time. It means that if there's a viewpoint out there that's not being represented, you have to give airtime to that viewpoint. So it could mean giving away free airtime. And this is often used by critics of conservatives to either break up a block of conservative programming or to force them to continue to give away free time until the stations just dump them. So what it actually does, actual fairness doctrine complaints, maybe 0.1% are actually followed up on. But it creates sort of a chilling effect where radio stations are reluctant to take on what they see as inherently controversial programs. And this is the problem for conservatives. In the 1950s and early 1960s, conservatism is seen as inherently controversial. So it's constantly opening up these fairness doctrine debates. And they argue that liberalism, because there's sort of a consensus, isn't seen as controversial. And so they have problems getting their viewpoints out there. So I think it's that chilling effect that's more of an issue. The balance objectivity thing, if we think from when Ox buys the New York Times in 1896, he begins to push for more objective reporting. By the 1940s in the US, that's the standard for newspaper and news reporting, this idea that journalists should be objective. You see that starting to change in the 1970s. It's no longer about sort of this ideal of an objective search for truth, but it's more about balancing and showing both sides of an issue, which has its own problems, but you see a shift away from objectivity by the 70s, and I would say that that shift was probably going to happen anyway because there's a cultural shift against authority, but what was going to replace it wasn't known, and I think conservatives were able to take that space, open it up, and make balance of ideological viewpoints the new sort of governing value.
But does anybody enforce that balance?
No. There's no sort of mechanism.
It's not obvious.
Right. Well, but you will see if CNN has on somebody talking about civil rights every once in a while, they'll have on, I don't know, Sons of the Confederacy. Like
what
they
about
feel
Rush Limbaugh? I mean, he doesn't.
Right. No, but what you see is it as a value for journalists, and Rush Limbaugh isn't a journalist.
Right.
This idea that you want to be balanced, that if you have on a liberal, you have on a conservative, that if you show one viewpoint, you have to show the other. If somebody is
so it opens up space in the national media for a conservative voice.
Right, and it reinforces this idea that that's what you should be aiming for. That's the value that media should have, is that they should present these different sides of an issue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You said that communism was a big issue back in the 60s and 70s, and I would just point out that it is today as well. I don't know if you heard this, but 60 or 70 Democratic members of Congress are members of the
78 to 81.
70, 81. Oh,
I know, the
sorry.
number goes up sometimes.
Oh, really? Oh, really?
Oh, I mean, not
Especially Alan West.
I'm sure West with
Republican congressman from Florida.
yeah.
The entire progressive caucus of the Democratic Party is
It's not
card-carrying
57.
members of the Communist Party.
It's not 57.
Not
I
57.
think it's widely
Oh,
recognized.
57, it's more.
I think that it's widely widely recognized by people other than Alan West, that is an overstatement.
But I was struck by, I couldn't help but think when, what was her name, Efron? That was sort of this conservative precursor to manufacturing consent. You know, Noam Chomsky's book on left. And I wondered, maybe you can comment a little bit on that. You're talking mainly about the conservative media, but you touched a little bit on this idea that, you know, the media in general is shifting towards this showing both sides. Can we say that media in general has moved more conservatively since the 70s?
How do you mean?
According to manufacturing consent, at least, they would say that these issues, the liberal issues, have increasingly been disappearing, and we're not hearing the other sides of a lot of issues, especially on foreign policy.
Right.
Is that because the conservative media has effectively shifted the debate to the right, would you say, or is it?
Or that Chomsky's wrong.
Huh?
Or that Chomsky's
Or
wrong.
that Chomsky is wrong. or you know, he's very good at sounding very scientific and is not.
Scientific about the brain.
Or isn't it the age-old thing that the far left and the far right both are critiquing the New York Times, and then they must be doing it right?
Well, there definitely is this sort of like collision of the right and the left. I mean, with the fairness doctrine, you have left-wing media that are having the same problems with the fairness doctrine. You certainly have the critique of objectivity and established media also coming from the left. Would I say that media have become more conservative? I think by opening the question of balance and by trying to ward off attacks of liberal media bias, I think it's fair to say that the media certainly reflect more of a conservative viewpoint than they would have, say, in the 1960s, say. But, you know, how do you measure these things? But it's an interesting question. And, you know, there's also the question of corporate
There must be a way to
ownership of
measure
media.
those things. I'm not saying you have to
right,
measure
right.
that. Sean, you have to measure
Yes.
that.
Put a political scientist on the case. Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, well, thanks. I would just sort of add that there was a huge debate about objectivity in the 50s when the lines were very much the objective people just reported what McCarthy said, and the non-objective people wanted to actually see if there was any evidence behind it.
Right.
And that was one of the lines of debate. But there's a sort of, you jump forward from the sort of end of Nixon, or the middle of Nixon really, to late 80s. And I was just wondering, I mean, Reagan mounted a challenge to Ford in 76. And I'm just wondering, post-Watergate, was there a regrouping of conservative positions? And in particular, did that lead to an even more vehement dislike of liberal media?
What happens after Nixon is actually really interesting vis-a-vis the relationship of conservative media to the GOP. When Nixon resigns, Ford takes over. He puts Nelson A. Rockefeller as the vice president, who is, conservatives' worst enemy. And they pretty much abandon the GOP for a brief period of time. In the mid-70s, you see a real move among conservative media and among conservatives to form a new majority party. This is a book that Bill Rusher writes. It's a call that's picked up by a lot of conservatives. This idea that, if you have to choose in 76 between, say, Rockefeller or Ford and a Democrat, you shouldn't be voting at all. So they were trying to get Reagan to run as a third-party candidate. As you know, Reagan challenges Ford. Reagan actually ends up losing the opportunity for the nomination because he decides to be more pragmatic than ideological. In order to pick up a few votes, he names a liberal Republican as his running mate, and there's a conservative bloc within the convention that then bolts and abandons Reagan. So he's not able to get the numbers that he needs. So there is sort of an abandonment of the GOP. And one of the interesting questions that I started to think about and don't have an answer for is, is it just a coincidence that at a time when conservative media is sort of at low tide, Ronald Reagan becomes president? And it's not really till the end of his presidency that conservative media began to sort of pick up steam again. So there's some interesting questions in the early 80s that I'm still sort of grappling with that I don't have answers for yet. But the liberal media bias thing is only going to pick up.
This is a very American account, which
Yes,
makes
very much
sense.
Yes.
But one is struck by how the media is changing everywhere, not just in the U.S., Britain, Australia. I mean, it's you know, this is not just an American phenomenon, and I'm wondering what's doing it, or is it an interaction effect with, I mean, where does Rupert Murdoch come from? I mean, what happens, how does all this interact?
Well, to a certain point, and this is not a question that I have a full answer to,
No.
but I mean, to a certain point, there's shared cultural and institutional and personnel linkages. I mean, they're trading ideas back and forth. The project that I want to work on in the next few years is to try to trace the development of conservative media in Anglosphere, in the Anglosphere. So looking at Australia and Britain and Canada and the US, what are the linkages and what are the differences that, you know, conservative media flourishes in the United States in ways that it hasn't in a place like Australia. There is conservative media, but it's just not on the scale. And so what are the...
Not if you talk to taxi drivers.
But what are the regulatory and cultural differences that cause these differences, as well as what are the linkages that unite them? That's a question that I've been really interested in lately. I haven't done the research for it. But
One of the big differences, I think, certainly between conservative and Australian conservative media, is that I think, notwithstanding your Hannitys and O'Reillys and these guys, the era you're looking at, there is a philosophical depth to people like Bill Buckley. I don't think you could apply that to the so-called shock jocks that taxi drivers would listen to on a daily basis. I think there is a
Or to Rush Limbaugh, for that matter.
Oh, of course, but
Yeah.
yes,
But you mean
indeed,
you-
absolutely,
yeah.
yeah. I think there is a difference.
yeah,
Where
I
the
think
Wall
that's
Street Journal editorial page is the classic case, you know, it's a fairly conservative, but it's got an intellectual heft that you don't quite get in Australia, I don't think.
Is it also an economies of scale thing?
Sure.
Yeah.
Population.
Yeah, that's right, population.
But there are also, you know, different speech laws and different regulations that are in
Right.
effect that I think do have an impact
It'd
on
be
this
really
question.
interesting to...
It's a really interesting question. That's what I want to look at it more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my kind of question.
Malcolm, did you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was just wondering whether you'd made a qualitative distinction between the forms of conservative media over time. And what I mean is that you're focusing on this period with Nixon, and the forms of media you're talking about are publications such as the National Review, where I think that those explicitly conservative publications would have the effect of deepening conservative values, and that conservatives would read these magazines and that might fortify their values. Whereas you mentioned that conservative media more recently in relation to the recent campaign has been through organisations such as Fox News, which are not explicitly conservative, even though they're known to be. You know, they're fair and balanced. And so it would seem that the conservative values that would be come through that form of media would be more broadening of conservatism. I wonder whether you made any distinction there in that, and whether that has any electoral impacts.
That's a really good question. I think that I do make a distinction between sort of this first wave conservative media, which includes broadcast as well as print, and the second wave. I mean, even somebody like Clarence Mannion, who has a radio show, I mean, he had been the dean of Notre Dame Law School. Like, this is a guy with some intellectual heft. Whereas if you look at second wave conservative media, you look at Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, none of these people have a college degree. They all started out as entertainers and then became voices of conservatism. So they're coming at it from a different sort of background. And it makes them more popular, and I think actually probably helps reinforce, if not conservative intellectual depth, then sort of a conservative
Populism.
a conservative sort of way of framing an understanding of the world that's different than sort of a serious intellectual inquiry.
Yeah, it seems like it's something that you could then have more of an electoral impact in that sense, in that it's populist. It's going to sound plausible and attractive.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're looking at things like the National Review, you're only going to accept the premise of those articles if you already accept that.
And it takes a while for that first wave of conservative media. It does eventually start forming majoritarian arguments and starts dabbling in populism, but at first it doesn't come easily to them. It's not their sort of native tongue. And the first 10 years or so, they're speaking in a specifically minoritarian language. Like, this is a republic, not a democracy. We're trying to, get this minority of right-minded individuals into power. And that changes after Goldwater loses. But yeah, I think that that's a really important distinction. Shane and then.
That was really interesting. I can't remember remember ever having heard Spiro Agnew taken seriously by anyone. I'd like to ask a historiographical question. You placed your stuff in the context of the media historiography. I'm just curious if you can tell me if there are any links to it. I'm totally unfamiliar with that historiography, but I'm thinking of the historiography of neo-conservatives and people like Steinfeld with that intellectual tradition going back to Viereck and people like that. What's the link between that stuff and the stuff you're talking about, or is there?
Right. Well, there absolutely is. I mean, we often talk about my work as media history, but it's also political history, it's intellectual history. Where I differ, or where I diverge from intellectual history, is intellectual history would look at somebody like Buckley, and they would just look at the message, right? They would look at the ideas that he's working with. What I'm interested in is how those ideas then get wrestled with and translated and fought over behind the scenes, how the linkages between, the people who are working at National Review and the people who are working at Human Events and the Mannion Forum and in the government, how they're trading those ideas and how they're trying to figure out the best way to reach audiences and how they change their message in response to business pressures and from audience response and things like that. So I'm not interested in looking at it purely in the realm of ideas. I'm looking at it more at an institutional level, but it definitely intersects with that intellectual history because ultimately, I do call them messengers because they are spreading these ideas and these messages.
Oh, it's Jane. That was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. And it's not a big question. I was just curious with the idea of populism and the shift that conservative media and liberal media, you could say, has taken in the past, 20 years or so, toward a kind of, this sort of populist mode. I was wondering first about the impact of Reagan in terms of, that's probably a whole nother chapter, right? And then you were talking about like Rush Limbaugh and all these sort of new generation of the shock jocks in the U.S. and I don't know about Australia. Coming from oh, you don't have any, right? I'm not there. But that they come from sort of entertainment backgrounds or whatever, right? So A, the class issue, and B, I'm really curious about the specificity of the media that you're talking about. So here you've got newspapers, right? Sort of the printed word, the kind of what Benjamin would say, the sort of contemplative mode that reading would bring versus, say, the radio, right? And then now the blog sphere and what that does, the new media in terms of mixing these different media and the kinds of audience which they have. So it would be interesting, for instance, to compare how the conservative, it's a huge question, right? I'm sure many people are talking about it, but how the conservative media versus, say, the liberal media are using social networking sites like Facebook or, huge question, right?
Right.
But I'm asking about the media specificity, I guess, more than anything else.
Right.
In terms of bringing it
Well, in terms of Reagan, and again, this is a question that I'm still sort of wrestling with. So you have sort of this low tide of conservative media. You have Reagan come in. Reagan peels off the Reagan Democrats, right? But the people who are voting for Reagan who were Democrats weren't necessarily conservatives. So in many ways, part of the project, I think, that conservative media pick up in the second wave is turning these new Republican voters into people who will embrace a conservative identity. They certainly don't have the power to force somebody to do that, right? But that they're beginning to sort of work over these new voters and make it not just a party shift, but an ideology shift. As far as the specificity, I mean, they're certainly hitting different types of arguments, and that's something that I look, there's different types of audiences, and that's something that I look at in the book, because you're not only getting, say, different audiences with radio versus, booksellers versus magazines, but so, for instance, the Mannion Forum changes over time. So it starts as a 15-minute broadcast, and then as people stop listening to radio at home so much and start listening more in their cars, he introduces something called the Mannion Forum footnote, which is a little 3-minute piece that goes on the radio. It's very short. It forces him to be more populist in tone. It forces him to be a little more colloquial, and so that reaches different audiences as well. And then the question about, how liberal media and conservative media different look, it's a huge question.
Yeah.
But there definitely were some studies being done in the early 2000s looking at how liberals and conservatives use social media differently. And what they found at the time was that conservatives had been using them just as sort of an extension of existing media, so using them as an echo chamber, right? Another way to get out ideas, whereas liberals were using them organizationally, and in part because they were the out party. So just as when conservatives are sort of outside the mainstream, they innovate and they find new ways to use the medium. What you see in the early 2000s are liberals doing the same. They're using the media in more innovative ways because they don't have access to necessarily the same traditional modes of power that conservatives have in the early 2000s. So I think that you see a big difference. I think that by this point, it's starting to even out quite a bit because there's a lot of borrowing back and forth. But at first, you saw much more innovation on the left with the new media.
I heard no resonances of racism in what you described in this set era of conservatism, and there's lots of it in the current period, and really begins with Reagan, and that's part of that democratic shift there.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a couple of things. There's an explicit attempt not to be sort of vulgarly racist.
Right.
You see it a little bit in some of these like
disruption and blah, blah, blah.
Right. Because part of what they're trying to do, especially after 64, is create a responsible conservatism. And that means separating it from sort of the particularly earthy Southern racism, right? They're trying to construct intellectual arguments. That's not to say that you don't see racism and racial politics coming up in this. Yes, they're talking about civil rights in terms of states' rights. Yes, they're talking about apartheid as anti-communism. But if you look at their letters, if you look at even some things in National Review, there is at times an explicit discussion of sort of racial superiority. It doesn't come out in particularly earthy ways, but it's definitely there, and it's something that I look at in the book.
Other questions?
Well, thank you all. This was
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.